Before we begin, we publish new content every day. So be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You would think that after 43 years of marriage, your own husband would remember your birthday. But there I was, 72 years old, sitting at the breakfast table on March 15th, watching Harold methodically spread peanut butter on his toast while discussing the weather forecast as if it were just another ordinary Tuesday. My name is Jenna, and I had been awake since 5 that morning, as I had been every morning for the past 4 decades, preparing his breakfast, laying out his clothes, organizing his medications. The routine had become as automatic as breathing. Yet that morning felt different somehow. Maybe it was the way the early spring light fell across our kitchen table, illuminating the small stack of birthday cards I had placed beside my coffee cup the night before. Cards from my sister in Oregon, my old college roommate, even one from our mailman, but nothing from the man sitting 3 feet away from me. Harold finished his toast and stood up, brushing crumbs from his cardigan. He kissed the top of my head absently, a gesture that had once made my heart flutter but now felt as perfunctory as checking items off a grocery list. "I have a meeting with Dr. Patterson at 9, he announced. "The car needs gas on the way back." After he left, I sat in the silence of our pristine kitchen and tried to recall when I had stopped expecting acknowledgement. When had I begun to shrink myself down to fit into the spaces between his requirements? The transformation had been so gradual that I had mistaken it for love. I had confused being needed with being valued. The house around me reflected 4 decades of Harold's preferences. Beige walls because color was distracting, minimal furniture because clutter upset him. Even the books on our shelves were his choices. My own books, the poetry collections and novels I had once loved, had been relegated to a small shelf in what Harold called the spare room, but what I had come to think of as my hiding place. Later that morning, I found myself in that room, running my fingers along the spines of books I had not opened in years. These books felt like messages from my former self, a woman who had once had opinions about things that mattered to her, who had dreamed of writing her own stories someday. The phone rang. It was my daughter Sarah calling from Seattle. "Happy birthday, Mom," she said. "I was hoping to catch you before you and Dad headed out to celebrate." I stared out the window at Harold's precisely trimmed hedge. "We are not celebrating," I heard myself say. He forgot. There was a long pause. "Mom," she said finally, "maybe you should say something to him." But I knew it was not distraction. Harold forgot nothing that mattered to him. He simply had not registered my birthday as worthy of his mental filing system. That afternoon, Harold returned from his appointment in an unusually talkative mood. Dr. Patterson had given him a clean bill of health. He settled into his recliner and launched into a detailed account of his conversation with the doctor. I sat on the sofa, nodding at appropriate intervals. This had become my role over the years, to be his audience, his sounding board, his reflection. I was so practiced at it that I could maintain the performance while my mind wandered elsewhere. The next morning brought the same routine, but something inside me had shifted. As I prepared his breakfast, I caught myself wondering what I would eat if I were making breakfast only for myself. When had I stopped considering my own preferences? I decided to test a theory. Instead of scrambled eggs, Harold's usual breakfast, I made French toast. It was a small rebellion, so minor it felt almost silly, but it represented something larger. Harold noticed immediately. "This is different," he observed. "I wanted to try something new," I replied, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. He ate it without comment, but I could feel his disapproval radiating across the table. Harold did not appreciate surprises. Change disrupted his carefully ordered universe. Over the following weeks, I began to make other small changes. I bought a novel I had been wanting to read and left it on the kitchen counter. I rearranged the living room furniture slightly. I planted tulips in the front yard, flowers that Harold had always dismissed as too short-lived. Each change was met with subtle resistance. The novel disappeared from the counter. The furniture was moved back. The tulips were not explicitly criticized, but Harold made several pointed comments about the neighbor's more sensible landscaping choices. I realized then that Harold's love was entirely conditional on my willingness to remain invisible. He loved the version of me that anticipated his needs, but he had no interest in loving the complete person I was. Meanwhile, I began to rediscover parts of myself that had been dormant for decades. I started writing again, scribbled in a notebook I kept hidden in my dresser drawer. I joined a book club at the library, telling Harold it was a volunteer commitment. I took long walks in the park, claiming they were for my health when really they were for my sanity. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in May. I had spent the morning at the library book club, discussing a novel about a woman who leaves her husband to travel through Italy. I returned home energized, filled with thoughts about the book and the stimulating discussion. Harold was in his usual spot, watching a financial news program. I sat down across from him, eager to share something that had genuinely moved me. I started to tell him about the book, about the themes of self-discovery that had resonated with me. Harold listened for perhaps 30 seconds before reaching for the remote control and turning up the volume on the television. The dismissal was so casual, so automatic, that it took my breath away. I sat there watching him watch his program, and suddenly I could see our entire marriage with devastating clarity. I was not a partner to Harold. I was not even really a person in his eyes. I was a service provider, a convenience. The realization should have made me angry, but instead, I felt something much more powerful. I felt clear. For the first time in decades, I could see my situation without the fog of obligation and habit that had obscured it for so long. That evening, after Harold had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad. I began to make lists: assets we owned jointly, bills that were in my name, accounts I would need to open, places I might want to live. It was not a plan for revenge. It was a blueprint for freedom. The next few months were a careful dance of preparation. I opened my own checking account at a different bank. I made copies of important documents and stored them in a safety deposit box Harold knew nothing about. I researched apartments in the part of town where my book club met. I also began to change in ways that were harder to measure. I stopped anticipating Harold's needs quite so completely. I let him discover for himself that he was out of his favorite cereal or that his shirts needed to be picked up from the cleaner. These were small withdrawals of service, but they represented something much larger. Harold noticed these changes but interpreted them as temporary lapses rather than deliberate choices. He would sigh dramatically when he had to pour his own orange juice. His irritation was palpable, but he never directly addressed what was happening. The final confrontation came on a Saturday morning in September. I had been planning to tell Harold about my decision to move out, but I wanted to wait until I had secured an apartment. Fate had other plans. Harold had gone to his monthly breakfast meeting with retired colleagues. I used these Saturday mornings to visit the apartment complex where I was hoping to rent a one-bedroom unit with a small balcony overlooking a garden. I returned home to find Harold standing in our bedroom, holding the notebook where I had been writing. My private thoughts, my tentative plans lay exposed in his hands like a broken bird. His face was flushed with anger. He waved the notebook at me as if it were evidence of a crime. "What is this?" he demanded. "What is all this nonsense about leaving and starting over?" He read passages aloud, his tone mocking: plans to rent an apartment, dreams of taking art classes, reflections on feeling invisible. Each revelation felt like a violation, but also like a liberation. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, looking at this man I had lived with for 4 decades, and felt nothing but a profound sense of distance. "You have lost your mind," he declared. "This is ridiculous, Jenna. You are 72 years old. You cannot just decide to start a new life." But I was not having a crisis. I was having an awakening. "You are right," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I am 72 years old, which means I probably have 15 or 20 good years left, and I refuse to spend them being invisible." Harold stared at me as if I had started speaking a foreign language. Over the next hour, he cycled through various strategies to regain control: anger, logic, guilt. But I had already moved beyond the reach of these familiar manipulations. I told him about the apartment I had found. I told him about the art classes I planned to take, the writing group I wanted to join, the trips I hoped to make. I told him about the woman I intended to become, the one who had been waiting patiently inside me for decades. Harold listened with growing disbelief. This was not the script he had expected our marriage to follow. The possibility that I might have my own ambitions had never factored into his calculations. The conversation ended with Harold storming out of the house, muttering about lawyers and the foolishness of women my age. I sat on our bed, surrounded by the scattered pages of my notebook, and felt something I had not experienced in years. I felt proud of myself. The weeks that followed were not easy. Harold alternated between cold silence and heated lectures about responsibility. He enlisted our mutual friends in his campaign to make me see reason. Some of them believed him. Others, particularly the women, looked at me with something that might have been envy, but I had moved beyond the need for universal approval. I packed my belongings methodically, taking only what belonged to me and what held genuine meaning. I left behind the beige walls and the life-sized portrait of Harold's preferences that had masqueraded as our home. The apartment I rented was smaller than our house, but it felt infinitely more spacious. I painted the walls colors I loved, hung art that spoke to me, filled the rooms with books and plants and small objects that made me smile. For the first time in decades, I was surrounded by things that reflected my taste, my interests, my personality. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center and discovered I had a modest talent for capturing light and shadow. I joined a hiking group for seniors and spent Saturday mornings exploring trails I had never known existed. I volunteered at a literacy center, helping adults learn to read. Most importantly, I began to write seriously again. The stories I had been scribbling evolved into essays and short memoirs. I joined a writers' group that met weekly at the library, a circle of thoughtful people who offered encouragement and honest feedback. My relationship with Harold settled into a distant but civil arrangement. We handled the practical aspects through lawyers, dividing assets with the same precision Harold brought to everything. He never asked about my new apartment or my activities. I was not surprised by this lack of curiosity. Sarah visited me in my new home and confessed that she had been worried about our marriage for years. She had seen my gradual disappearance, my transformation from the vibrant woman she remembered into someone who seemed to exist primarily as an extension of her father's needs. She was proud of me for choosing myself, she said. One evening, as I sat on my small balcony watching the sun set over the garden below, I reflected on the strange arithmetic of my life. I had spent 43 years being the person Harold needed me to be. If I lived to 90, I would have nearly 20 years to be the person I needed me to be. The trade seemed more than fair. I thought about the woman I had been when I first met Harold, young and full of dreams. She had believed that love meant accommodation, that marriage required the gradual surrendering of self. She had been wrong about many things, but she had been right about her capacity for love. She had simply been loving the wrong person. Now, at 73, I was finally getting to know the woman I might have become if I had not spent so many years trying to become someone else. She was more interesting than I had expected, funnier and braver and more creative. She had opinions about art and politics and literature. She liked spicy food and bold colors and conversations that lasted past midnight. The other women in my writing group often asked how I had found the courage to leave my marriage so late in life. But it had not felt like courage in the moment. It had felt like necessity. I had simply reached the point where staying would have cost me more than leaving. I told them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the recognition that some things were more frightening than fear itself. For me, the most terrifying prospect had been reaching the end of my life and realizing I had never actually lived it. My days now were filled with small pleasures and meaningful pursuits. I read books that challenged me. I took photographs of interesting shadows and cloud formations. I wrote letters to old friends I had lost touch with. I learned to cook cuisines Harold had never liked. On quiet evenings, I sometimes felt a fleeting sadness for the marriage I had thought I was living. But the sadness was not for what I had lost. It was for what had never actually existed. I was mourning an illusion. The reality was that I had been alone for decades while living in the same house with another person. The loneliness of my marriage had been far more profound than the solitude of my current life, because it had carried with it the constant disappointment of hoping for connection that never came. As winter approached, I began planning a trip to Italy for the spring. It would be my first solo international travel. Harold had always controlled our vacation plans, choosing destinations based on their educational value. We had visited many museums, but I had never been anywhere simply because I wanted to experience its beauty. I enrolled in Italian language classes at the community center. My teacher, Maria, told me that learning a new language at any age was an act of optimism, a declaration that you believed in your own future. Her words stayed with me. I was not just learning to speak Italian. I was learning to believe in the possibility of transformation at any stage of life. The holidays that year were different. Sarah invited me to spend Thanksgiving with her family in Seattle. Harold and I had always hosted his extended family, a formal affair that left me exhausted and invisible. Sarah's Thanksgiving was chaotic and warm and filled with genuine affection. My grandchildren responded to my newfound lightness with enthusiasm. They were getting to know their real grandmother for the first time. As the new year began, I settled into routines that nourished rather than depleted me. My writing was improving, becoming more honest and confident. I had completed several essays about my experience of late-life liberation, and my writing group encouraged me to consider submitting them for publication. I also began volunteering at a domestic violence shelter, offering support to women facing the kind of choices I had made. I shared my story not as an expert but as a fellow traveler who had found her way to the other side of an impossible situation. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came my trip to Italy. I had planned a 2-week journey to Rome, Florence, and the small hill towns of Tuscany. The night before my departure, I felt a moment of panic. What if I could not navigate foreign airports alone? But the panic passed quickly, replaced by excitement and curiosity. Italy exceeded every expectation. The art was more beautiful, the food more flavorful, the people more warmly welcoming than I had imagined. I spent hours in museums, not because I felt obligated but because beauty moved me to tears. I ate meals that lasted for hours, savoring conversations with fellow travelers who shared my sense of adventure. In Florence, I met an American woman named Dorothy who was traveling alone for similar reasons. She had recently divorced her husband after discovering his affair. We spent an evening comparing stories of liberation. Dorothy told me that the most radical thing a woman could do at our age was to believe she deserved joy, not just contentment or security, but actual joy. I returned from Italy with a suitcase full of small treasures and a heart full of expanded possibilities. I had proven to myself that I was capable of navigating the world independently, of finding wonder in unexpected places. My writing took on new depth after the trip. I completed a collection of essays about aging, independence, and the courage required to change course late in life. To my amazement, a small publishing house accepted my manuscript. Seeing my words in print felt like the culmination of a journey I had not even known I was taking. The book launch was held at the library where my book club met. Friends from my various new communities gathered to celebrate. Sarah flew in from Seattle, beaming with pride for her mother, who had become someone she had never seen before but had always hoped existed. Harold was not invited, but I found myself thinking about him as I looked around the room full of people who appreciated the woman I had chosen to become. I felt no anger toward him anymore, only a kind of bemused sadness for what he had missed by being incapable of seeing me clearly. Now, at 74, I wake each morning with a sense of anticipation I had not felt since childhood. I have no idea what adventures this day might bring. The uncertainty that once terrified me has become a source of excitement and possibility. I think often about the woman I was on my 72nd birthday, sitting at that breakfast table while Harold discussed the weather and ignored the cards beside my coffee cup. She could not have imagined the life I am living now. But she was braver than she knew. That woman who made French toast instead of scrambled eggs and called it rebellion. She was already beginning to remember who she was beneath all those decades of accommodation. She was taking the first tentative steps toward a life that would honor the fullness of her humanity. I wish I could tell her that the courage she was seeking was already inside her, waiting to be claimed. I wish I could assure her that the leap she was contemplating would not destroy her but would finally allow her to fly. The resource was never depleted, as it turned out. It had simply been redirected toward the wrong recipient for far too long. Now, Finally, I am the beneficiary of my own love, attention, and care. And there is more than enough to go around.